Before I begin the homily, I want to thank the volunteers for the washing of the feet, especially those who responded to my desperate plea at the last moment. Maybe you help us understand the gospel in a very radical way tonight. When I was in formation studying theology, I spent 2 years studying at Maryville. And every now and then there was one priest I would have lunch with sometimes in the dining room. He was a missionary for many years in Guatemala, and he was home on sick leave. And one of the things he had to do as part of his therapy sometimes was doing crocheting. It helped him with the arthritis in his hands and a few other things he was suffering. And sometimes I would see him outside the building, sitting in the garden doing his crocheting. And I would talk to him. And he was a very wise man, knew a lot of experience. And one time he was asking me if something was going on in our community at the time. It was a very difficult moment for many of us. And he said, "What's going on with the Capuchins?" So I told him. And he could see how upset I was about the whole thing and how angry I was. And he let me talk, and at one point he said to me, "Always remember one thing." And it's one of those things I remember is very true about life. He said, "Hindsight is always 20/20. And I looked at him and I said, "Huh?" He goes, "You don't realize what's going on when you're in the middle of something, whether it's a joyful moment or a difficult situation or a crisis. It's only after time, and perhaps when you're physically away from it, you can begin to process what was taking place and realize what was going on. You can see it much more clearly after time has passed and you're away from it physically as well as mentally. And if there's one lesson I've learned in life, and there's several, that's what I absolutely believe in. Hindsight is 20/20. When we look back at certain moments in our lives, things that may have been very critical, very difficult situations, when we look back at them, over maybe 10 years or 5 years or more, and perhaps we moved, we can understand them a little bit differently. We can see them more clearly and realize that's what was going on. That's what they were getting at. That's what I was so angry about back then. It gives us a clearer vision. And certainly it's true as we approach the scriptures many times. As we read them, that was written thousands of years ago, we begin to understand them more clearly. Certainly it was true for the gospel writers as they wrote them 30 or 40 or 50 years after Jesus ascended back to the Father. They began to understand. They understood a little more clearly what Jesus meant when he was taught about love your enemies, about what happened to him on the mountain of the Transfiguration. And even when we hear in today's gospel about the washing of the feet, even he understands it as well. You don't understand this now, but later you will understand. But then he asks me the question later, do you realize what I have done for you? And that's the question the Lord asks us tonight. Do you understand what I have done for you? What Jesus does in the washing of the feet is quite radical in his time. The custom was, in many cultures, including the Jewish culture, that when guests came into your house, you washed their feet. Whether they were barefoot or they wore very loose sandals. The roads were dusty and dirty, so you had to wash their feet. It was seen as a sign of hospitality and welcome. But for the Jewish people, it was also seen as a danger of ritual impurity, that they could not enter the temple or the synagogue. Because you don't know what the feet walk through, and you might risk impurity by washing those feet. So if you had the money, you had a Gentile slave, whose main responsibility was to do that, to wash the feet of the guests. If you didn't have one, then you washed your own feet. Or you might have another slave do it. But the one thing that was never expected was that the host, or the head of the house, would wash the feet of the guests. It was forbidden. It was a very patriarchal society. They understood who the leaders were. It was unheard of that the head of the house, the host, would wash the feet of his guests, let alone of his family. And yet he, who they call master and teacher, gets up from the table, takes off his cloak, ties a towel around his waist, and washes the feet of the disciples. We can only imagine how uncomfortable the 12 felt in that upper room. They're probably saying, what's going on? Why is he doing this? Somebody do something. Someone say something. This is really not supposed to be happening. They're probably looking at John because he was the youngest. You're the youngest, you should be doing this at least. They don't know what to make of it. Peter somehow has the gumption, as he usually does, to stand and say something. Why are you doing this? You don't understand it now, you will later. And if you don't let me do it now, you won't have a share in my inheritance. Well, wash my head and my hands as well. No, this is enough. They still don't get it. And you also wash the feet of Judas. It's not recorded in the gospel in this way, but Judas does leave the supper a little bit later in this chapter. After Jesus gives him the morsel and saying, that which you must do, do now. And that's when he leaves. But Jesus washes the feet of Judas, knowing he's up to no good. He's arranging for Jesus to be arrested. He somehow knows in the depth of his heart, this one will betray me. And yet he washes his feet. That's rather challenging for us. Who we choose, in a sense, to wash feet of. Is it just people we like? What about those we consider our enemies? Or those who have hurt us? Because what the washing of the feet is truly an act of service. But for Jesus to do it truly is an act of radical service. We sometimes sanitize it with this nice ritual we do on Holy Thursday. Traditionally, the Pope washed the feet of bishops. Well, their feet are clean already. Or the bishop, although our new Pope has done it quite differently. He goes to youth detention centers and washes the feet of others, regardless of whether they're Catholic or Muslim or male or female. Because he wants to bring home that lesson of what Jesus does in his gospel. The bishop of a diocese washes the feet of priests or maybe seminarians or the trustees of the cathedral. They usually have clean feet. And the same is true in parishes. And some people see it as an honor and a privilege to be asked by the pastor to have their feet washed. It's not about that at all. It's a very jolting lesson we're supposed to learn tonight. About humility, about service to one another. It kind of encapsulates what we heard on Palm Sunday in the second reading, Paul's letter to the Philippians. That we must have the same attitude of Christ. That though he was the Son of God, he emptied himself of all and became a slave, became one like us in all things but sin. It's the mystery of the Incarnation. It's the mystery that we celebrate tonight and tomorrow. That as this slave, he does this very menial task of washing the feet of the disciples. But it only truly makes sense with what comes in the other Gospels, the institution of the Eucharist. That this one who gave himself in service to others also gives himself to us in the Eucharist to be our food and our drink. It only fully makes sense with what we celebrate tomorrow. That as that slave obedient to the will of the Father, he embraces the wood of the cross and reveals the depth of that love of God and that mercy of our God. It was mind-blowing for the disciples to see this. It's still meant to blow our minds and to challenge us. It calls us to a real serious act of service. The kind of things that we often find difficult to do. Perhaps staying up late night with the kids when they're sick with the flu. Or taking care of a loved one who's bedridden, and we have to wash them and clean them and feed them. Or going out in the middle of a very difficult storm to buy food for our family, or perhaps food for a neighbor who's a shut-in. It's those hard, radical acts of service that we're called to do. But Jesus asked that question at the end. Do you understand? Do you realize what I have done for you? The 12 didn't that night. It took them quite some time. Probably John finally understood when he wrote the Gospel. But for 2,000 years, the Lord still asks us that question on this most holy night. Do Do we understand what the Lord has done for us? Do we understand what we do tonight? Do we really understand?